Okay, welcome back then. We're in early July 1860, and unfortunately we have had a case of a lost recording. I just made a video. It was quite long. I mean, we left off in kind of, late April, so it was early May through to late July. Not much happened in the video, to be fair. It was, for the most part, me waffling interminable nonsense and kind of discussing plans and so on and so forth. There were some developments which I'll have to walk you through, but in this case it was I think it may have been because it was quite a long video. It was about an hour and a half, which it's hard to gauge how long the videos are whilst you're making them, because the videos are paused and we pass turn and this sort of thing. But in any case, when I've complete the recording, the freeware requires about like an hour or so, half hour to an hour, to actually process the video or process the recording into an MP4 that I can then upload onto YouTube. And in this case, the freeware was doing it, and it just crashed. It just closed, and I thought, right, okay. So yeah, luckily for the most part, the action that really happened was really in the last turn. It was kind of culminating really to this turn. So the video would have been the Battle of Sarajevo, and I guess that will sort of still be the video. But I want to sort of because I think during warfare it's a worthwhile thing to kind of follow the action, because it would be very hard to actually do videos like this regularly, to do like videos every couple of months depicting a war, because of course there's constant movement and this sort of thing. So not a huge amount of change. There have been a couple of developments. One, there was a fairly a fairly concerted attempt by the Austrians to take Sarajevo, and that began really with kind of early May, past turn to early May. We began to see Austrian forces assembled, besieging Sarajevo, and large forces assembled in Bosnia. They assaulted Sarajevo, failed to take it, but came close, but they suffered very heavy losses. The Free Hungary Corps sustained losses, although it's now reconstructing itself. The additional Free Austria Corps had a couple of elements which have been destroyed, and the garrison now has been demobilized because we've lifted the siege. But that was one of the sort of significant developments. We lost a couple of national morale points because of heavy losses, but also gained a couple of national morale points. There were various successive attempts by the Austrians to force the issue at Sarajevo, and it didn't come off. We eventually maneuvered our kind of forces into play and moved to lift the siege at Sarajevo, which we did, and we have only just done that, and it was an absolutely titanic battle, and we'll look at the results of that in a moment. The other main development was that Austria cut a peace deal with Romania. Now, it looks like one of Austria's territorial claims is Bucharest, which they pressed. They now control Bucharest, but they're at peace with Romania, but they do have military access rights through Romania. Now, Romania is split into two territories. Bucharest is not yet the capital of Romania. I mean, it seems to still be kind of in Moldavia. It's still a principality, but it's now split into two again, really, even though it may be a single polity. What became the capital of Romania, the Kingdom of Romania in the 1870s, is Bucharest, is controlled by Austria now, ahistorically. It's a claim they never pressed in real life, but they now have it, and a part of Romania now functions as an exclave of the remainder of the principality, in Drobeta, I think. Yeah, it's called Drobeta. But the Austrians do have access rights. I wasn't sure whether they could transit through Romania, because we're in a war with Romania, and then move into our territory. I wasn't sure whether that would be the case. Turns out I think they can. And I've only just realised that because Austrian forces are now moving through Romania into kind of northern Bulgaria. Now, first of all, let's have a look at what we've done on the western part of the front. We've got a raiding force in Montenegro, besieging an Austrian garrison there, and we moved our forces to lift the siege. There's a titanic battle, the Battle of Sarajevo, easily the biggest battle of this war so far, an absolutely colossal engagement. It was a victory for us. It involved both Hussein Avni's army and Omar Pasha's army in support. Forces of a similar size, about 230,000 apiece. We lose 26,000, we inflict 53,000. We only take 2,000 prisoners. That's striking. And the actual number of elements destroyed is relatively small. In fact, if we look at the Austrian forces, it's mostly fortress artillery that they presumably had brought into the area to actually move into Sarajevo once they took it. So these are static formations. They can't really fall back, or they're going to take heavy losses if the remainder of the Austrian army falls back. So it actually looks like the Austrians fell back in pretty good order, which didn't really happen much in the last war. So it shows actually that the Austrian force is still being defeated by our better leadership, and in some ways better quality troops, a very large guard contingent of elite infantry. But yeah, they fell back in fairly good order. But that is the first big victory in the bag. We get a national morale point for it. That like I say, I mean, after Cattaro, it was really a spoiling raid at Cattaro. That's the first significant engagement. There have been various Austrian attempts to force across the Danube into Plevna. We can still see they have forces in Plevna, and there are a number of engagements there. These are fairly small. These were kind of brigade-sized forces, like reconnaissance forces, spear tips, that were pretty badly mauled, but they weren't significant forces. They weren't even completely destroyed, actually. I mean, in this case, they did lose a couple of elements, but they only lost about 3,000 casualties. Mind you, actually, there's some fairly heavy prisoners. We took 3,200 prisoners, so actually they might have been almost virtually destroyed. That was the first engagement at Plevna. There was an additional engagement, which again, this looks like about a division size, maybe slightly smaller division, couple of brigades. Again, fairly, 6,500 casualties we inflicted them. Take 3,200 prisoners, only lose 1,300 men ourselves. So, yeah, again, I mean, like this is fairly small stuff, but it shows that the Austrians are failing to kind of like get a toehold on Plevna. They do have a large force now, however, in the region, and we have got Abdi Pasha set to an offensive posture to clear Plevna. And on the right, Abdul Karim Nadir. We have now got our two eastern armies basically functioning in place and working in tandem. Abdul Karim Nadir is going to be looking to lift the siege at Constanta. The reason for that is at Constanta, the structure is partially breached now. This city has been under siege since, I think, late May. They moved in late May. There haven't been any significant engagements here. There's been small, tentative prodding, really, across the Danube, but they've not managed to get a consistent toehold. This is the largest force they've managed to get across, and it's going to be obviously a fairly large engagement with that now, and also probably a sizable engagement in Constanta. These two forces are still close enough that they can support each other, which is important. It's going to take Abdul Karim Nadir 11 days to get to Constanta anyway, and by that time, hopefully the deal should be sort of wrapped up in Plevna, allowing Abdi in turn to support Abdul Karim Nadir. So we're going to be looking at a couple of big actions now to secure the kind of southern bank of the Danube. That is pretty much it. Now, the other real development is that as this was happening, as we kind of re-secured sort of Sarajevo, Austrian forces are now pouring through the Reta, crossing the Danube in this undefended frontier. We have Bashi Bazouks in Agosta, really just to garrison the town, just to ensure that if they set on an offensive posture, they just pass through, and we still control the town, but they have some control over the surrounding region as they've passed through. But there's now a fairly sizable Austrian army. Looking at these Austrian armies and the combat factor, what I'm able to see is that, for one, Austrian forces have a lot of firepower. That's the main development. It's not just that they have a bigger army. It's not like their army is 4 or 5 times larger than ours, as I initially suspected might be the case. It's actually that the combat factor of their forces is significantly increased. Probably due to a couple of theoretical developments, some military scientific developments that they're just ahead of the curve on, but also firepower. They built a lot of guns. I mean, when they attempted to assault Sarajevo, they were only field guns, so they had a fairly limited effect in an assault, but and they had something like 2,000 guns. At one point, they had about 400,000 troops in attempting to take Sarajevo. They've really struggled, and they keep peeling forces off, as they have here, to kind of recover, and we've basically created a bit of elbow room here now, so we can now throw our kind of weight to the right foot. We now have to secure the west bank of the Danube, which we're going to be doing now. That's pretty much it. For the most part, that's what's happened. The only other kind of combat, really the last round, is just the kind of, 7-8 year campaign, which is sort of ongoing to really secure, kind of, at the very least, secure the western part of the Yemen. We are now detaching some guns because we have constructed a 5th Field Army for the most part. I'll take you through that in just a moment. But we've been capturing guns from Yemeni insurgents for years that we're able to construct batteries out of. these aren't really necessary here, and these batteries actually will be helpful in the European theatre. One of the difficulties we have in the Yemen, I mean, this is obviously peripheral at the moment, you know, to the main action, which is in the Balkan Peninsula, but is that the main issue that we have is that we have forces that have to constantly move around to kind of lift sieges, but in order to actually conduct counter-insurgency operations, essentially against the local populace, to reduce the revolt risk, and let's be clear, this is where the Yemenis get their reinforcements from. It's from the local population revolting, at least the military-age male population joining the ranks of these columns. The only way that we can stop that and ultimately starve these columns of reinforcements is to conduct, basically, to prosecute military expeditions against the population. Pretty bleak stuff. It's, you know, mid-19th century war crimes, but that's how colonial empires were built, frankly, in the mid-19th century. But it's something that takes a long time. These expeditions can take months. It's a very lengthy process, I suppose, of combing through hamlets, finding men that are military age, male, this kind of thing, and doing whatever it is they did with them, put them into camps or worse perhaps. But that's basically how these kind of regions are secured, especially colonial regions, which are, you know, the local population won't take it laying down. They've got some real fight in them, and that's definitely the case. I mean, the Yemen is turning out to be a really tough nut to crack, but it won't suffice for us to constantly move our forces around, engaging them, because it's sort of you're just fighting a nest of fire ants, you know. So we need to get, at some point, once we have the available manpower, once we don't have commitments in Europe, to get small brigades permanently based, at the very least in Sana'a and Aden. We did have a brigade at one point permanently based in Sana'a. That was destroyed when Sana'a at one point was briefly taken, so we need to reconstruct that. But anyway, that's the long-term plan, because otherwise this is just going to be a forever counter-insurgency, which we're going to constantly, you know, moving forces around in endless cycles, chasing down the Yemenis. So that's the conclusion that we've drawn. That's something that I've realised anyway. It's just that we've not really been able to conduct counter-insurgency kind of operations, prosecute military expeditions against the population, because we've had to move our forces around. And you have to have your force in location for like 2 months. And we've just not been in a position to do that. I've always had to move, you know, so, and the forces that we've been engaging are large enough that we need all of the forces that we have to move. We can't leave. We can't break off and peel off like one of these Marine brigades, because that force just wouldn't have enough punch in it then to do the job. So anyway, that's been the kind of ongoing drama with Yemen. Now, the 5th Army is partially constructed. For the time being, Rita Pasha is being given command of the Imperial Guard Force. He's moving towards Adrianople. In Adrianople, we have one of the corps, which has been constructed and moved by rails from Ankara. We have another corps being constructed in Smyrna, which is almost constructed, along with a logistical tail, which will be the supply train of the army. Plus, we have the various service asset units, which are on rails now. They're 4 days away from Adrianople, and that's an engineer, provost, and field hospital service asset unit. That is, for the most part, the tools that we need to construct an army. We do need a cavalry division. We don't quite have the manpower at the moment, or at least the officers, but we're not far off. We're like a fortnight, maybe a month off doing that. And then we're going to be bringing those guns from the Yemen, various captured Yemeni guns. I mean, they can't construct guns, so they're probably being supplied by some outside force. But we keep capturing them, so we actually might as well put these guns to good use, send them to the European theatre. That's pretty much it. That is actually all that's been missed. The only other one thing that happened is we have conducted a counter-piracy operation in the Sea of Oman. It was successful. 3 raider ships were sunk to no loss of our own. Pretty heavy weather. So our kind of Persian Gulf flotilla is on its way back to Basra after 6. These are important. These operations. They're small. They're successful, but they give more junior naval officers a bit of experience. And part of the reason for that is we do have to look at the long-term leadership of our Navy. Especially this decade, we do have plans for the Navy. We're going to be looking at seismic expansion. And we want a kind of, you know, a cadre of experienced officers, even if it's conducting counter-insurgency operations. Talking as a maritime warfare, we have had fairly substantial Austrian raiding operations. At one point, we lost about... Bear in mind that each one of these elements is comprised of 4 ships. So this is, you know, this box represents our overall merchant maritime kind of presence in the Mediterranean. So we've got, I don't know, I can't figure out what the math is, but we've got, enough ships. In fact, we could probably just, 48 ships, there we go. 48 merchant ships operating in the Mediterranean. At one point, we lost about 12 to 14 in one fortnight from a fairly substantial raiding operation. They've peeled a lot of those raiders off now, and some of those raiders are located in the western approaches. It looks like, they've not made contact with our merchants yet. That has kind of eaten in to some of our private finance, because we've had to use private finance to construct merchants to basically, that's how strategic warfare is, really. That's the way that you hurt an economy, either by destroying plants or by conducting raiding operations against enemy merchants. And as the game develops and other kinds of strategic warfare will develop, of course. Now, the other real development is the economic crisis about a month ago arrived in the Ottoman Empire. So we are now sharing the global economic crisis. So basically, it instantly resulted in us losing like 5 national morale points. Inflation's up to 5% from nothing. And we instantly lost off an average population satisfaction about 5%. We've had a partial recovery, but it's going to be slow now. Costs are higher. Domestic demand has slackened off. Exports aren't too bad. Exports were initially kind of quite badly hit, but we lost a lot of private capital, like about 1,000 private capital. We actually had a really, really good trade run that particular term, but we didn't see any of it. It just vanished into the ether, because the bottom fell out of the market. So we are now in the midst of an economic crisis, as well as what looks to be a really, really serious conflict with Austria. This is not going to be a small conflict, and I'm already, it's. I'm not sure whether we're going to be looking at options of occupying central Hungary and Vienna like we did in the last war. The way that the Austrians are moving is kind of how I thought they would move in the last war, but they didn't. Their intervention in the last war was obviously very clumsy. Their initial invasion was very dislocated, and we really kind of made the most of it. We rolled them up, we engaged them in some set pieces in Bosnia. They were obviously tied up elsewhere also, and we made the most of that. But they're moving in a very methodical way. They're keeping their forces. They do have, the way that they're doing it is they're really large. They do still have a large army with a lot of reserve army corps, but they keep these like reserve corps in a kind of reserve formation, and then trickle those forces in. They kind of switch forces out from their field commands. They still have command penalties because they still have armies that are too large, but for the most part, they are kind of rationally using their forces. They're not trying to swamp us with their forces just yet, anyway. But yeah, I mean, still have substantial. They've still got a good 200, 300,000 forces scattered around here. I mean, they've got an army corps under Benedek and Katero. I'm half tempted to assault that, but we do need to really go hell-leathered for Niš. The good thing with the move against Niš, or our counter-strike at Niš, basically, as we took Sarajevo, they moved through, and they're obviously looking to kind of envelop us, maybe trap our forces in Bosnia. So we're kind of moving back to secure our lines of communication. And the good thing with this is it's led by Omar Pasha. It's a nice set piece. He excels at this stuff. It's on flat terrain, and he's got the support of Hussein Avni. So my thinking is this engagement should be fairly sound, but Austrian forces are quite likely to flood south in support. So this could be a big engagement. We'll see what happens here, but I feel fairly comfortable about this. On the right, it's a bit dicier. I mean, they don't have any Austrian commanders here that we can see, at least anyway, but there are large Austrian forces in this region. It's hard to get a clear picture on it. These aren't, I mean, Abdul Karim Nadir and Avdi Pasha, probably not, at the moment at least anyway, our best offensive commanders, to be frank. They're not terrible, but they're not great. But they each control an army that is organised around the Guard Corps. That's important. It does give them a real edge. It means that, the core of their field command is this professional force, which the Austrians don't have. The one thing the Austrians have loads of are reserve army corps. And I think what this comes from is their kind of ability to mobilise their male population, the kind of levy en masse tradition of kind of, European armies. Our army is a little bit like the kind of personal property of the ruling house. It's not an army that's kind of rooted in it's not like the same as a medieval army, because the Ottoman state had a large bureaucracy and this kind of thing, but it is like a much more of a standing army, our army, whereas their armies that you know, they draft huge numbers of men and equipment very, very quickly. That's kind of what they've done. Plus they've built a lot of guns, they've got a lot of firepower, and the quality of some of their corps, like the combat quality of their corps, is some of them is very high indeed. I don't think they're guard corps. I just think that they're just very modern, very effective kind of fighting forces. But anyway, this is a little bit of a shorter video. It would have been an hour and a half video, but that's basically an update, and that's not missing anything. That's really the only thing. There's been no revolts anywhere. There's been no other kind of dramas. Nothing has been converted into a colony. It's just been really everything building up to the Battle of Sarajevo, and it took a bit of time because I had to kind of force march Omar Pasha through towards Kosovo. Hussein Avenue was in pretty rough shape when he was sitting in kind of Zornik, so we had to wait for a bit of time, for about a month, for these forces to get themselves in a position where they can counter against Sarajevo. And the initial Austrian force of Sarajevo was massive. It was really, really big. They assaulted Sarajevo of like 400,000 men. They didn't take it. You know, shows the value of these fortresses, and it's really shown also the value of the Free Hungary Corps. You know, it's really, really done a good job in conjunction with the garrison, which has now been sort of demobilized. But I'll leave the video there, and what we're going to do is the next video we'll pick up. We're in early July, in late July. You can see the moves that we're going to be making. We're going to be countering their attempted development by looking to get a set piece at Niš, and we're going to be looking to launch a counter stroke really on the south bank of the Danube, lifting the siege of Constanta. And we have to do that. The siege of Constanta is on the clock. The fortress is partially breached. That force has been in position for quite some time, more than a month now, besieging that fort. Abdul Karim and Abdi Pasha were not activated for much of this time, actually. And it took, I mean, when we left off, Abdul Karim's force is being assembled in Adrianople, and has not long been assembled. But his field command is now in place. It's an assembled, rational field command. It's about sort of what, 93,000 men, so it's about the size of an average field army. So these forces are activated, they're assembled, and we're now just getting the 5th Army together. So I'll leave it there, because I think one thing is that long videos might make this software more prone to crash, because of course the video has to accumulate, I suppose, sits on the kind of RAM until it's converted. You know, an hour and a half video is quite a lot to kind of sit in short-term memory. So anyway, I'll leave the video there. We'll pick up in late July. And apologies for having missed the last sort of month, but luckily the only action that's happened has happened in the last third anyway. So the only other thing that's happened that you missed was an attempted assault against Sarajevo. We probably inflicted about 60,000 to 70,000 casualties on the Austrians in those various assaults. So that was pretty good, and you can see that some forces have had to peel off. They've fallen back to kind of recover and receive replacements and that sort of thing. So that's good. It means that, like, by inflicting this damage, it forces the Austrians to take forces out of the field, and it means that we're kind of able to defeat them in detail for the time being. But these are large forces, and at times it's feeling a little bit like our head is in the vice. But, you know, we're not in the situation we were when we were fighting Russia back in *53, when we had like one field command under Omar Pasha, you know, just rushing around at a partially formed field. We've got four armies under, you know, experienced leaders, and they're like, I think if this big engagement at Sarajevo has proven anything, it's that toe-to-toe, equal numbers, our boys can still very much hold their own against the Austrians, despite the fact that it looks like they've probably gone through a bit of a qualitative leap, despite the fact that they've significantly expanded their army, and despite the fact that they are much more experienced now. People like Franz Graf Wimpfen, like, you know, he's a fairly experienced commander now. He's fought a number of battles against us, against Piedmont, Sardinia, against France. And, you know, he's been fighting wars now for a good 4 or 5 years. So their commanders are experienced, but we can still absolutely nail them in the field, toe-to-toe, with, you know, with some kind of force parity. So we can draw some encouragement from that. And there'll be plenty more big engagements like that, I think, before this is over, probably in the next fortnight. So I'll leave it there. Next video will pick up in late July, and we'll be reporting back on what's happening. What hopefully will be a big battle in Niš. And yeah, look to see what happens, whether we can lift the force, lift the siege of Constanta and secure the south bank of the Danube. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.